It all started with a decision, a fresh start, a new life. I had been saving up for months to move out of my cramped apartment in New York City. The noise, the chaos, the endless crowds, it was suffocating. So when I found a listing for a house in the quiet town of Ashwood, I jumped on it. It was everything I had been dreaming of. A quaint little place surrounded by woods, far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. But something felt off. From the moment I arrived at the house, there was this strange energy in the air. I don't know how to describe it. It was like the house was watching me. And then there was the note. The previous tenant had left a handwritten letter taped to the fridge. It read, "Welcome to your new home. To ensure your safety, please follow these rules carefully." At first I thought it was some kind of joke, but the list of rules was bizarre. Do not open the windows after sunset, no matter what you hear. If you see a man standing at the edge of the woods, do not acknowledge him. He cannot hurt you unless you let him in. Always leave an offering of bread and salt on the kitchen counter before going to bed. Do not leave the house after midnight. If you find yourself outside during this time, do not look back. I laughed nervously, brushing it off as some kind of prank. But something about those rules sent chills down my spine. Before we dive deeper into this story, I want to ask you, if you were in my place, would you stay in the house or leave immediately? And by the way, tell me where you're watching this from in the comments below. I'm really curious to know. That first night, I did my best to settle in. I unpacked a few boxes, set up my bed, and tried to make the place feel like home. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere in the house changed. I swear, it felt colder, like the shadows in the corners were growing darker. The silence wasn't comforting, it was oppressive. Around 9 p.m., I heard it. The sound of footsteps outside. They weren't hurried or loud, just deliberate. I froze, remembering the first rule. Don't open the windows after sunset, no matter what you hear. I crept to the window, my heart pounding, and peeked through the curtain. There was no one there. But the footsteps continued, circling the house slowly. I backed away, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then, at exactly midnight, it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It felt heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something. The next morning, I decided to explore the town. Everyone seemed friendly, but when I mentioned the house, their smiles faded. One old woman, her hands trembling, whispered, "You need to leave that place. It's not safe." When I pressed her for details, she shook her head and walked away. That night, I decided to test the rules. Call me stupid, but I needed to know if this was all just in my head. I skipped the bread and salt offering and stayed up late, watching the clock. At exactly 3 a.m., I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, they weren't outside. They were inside the house. Slow, deliberate, and coming from upstairs. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I made my way up the stairs, each creak of the wood sounding like a gunshot in the silence. The footsteps stopped at the guest bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a faint light coming from inside. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I pushed the door open. The room was empty. But on the wall, written in what looked like charcoal, were the words, "You broke the rules." I don't know what kept me from leaving right then and there. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I didn't want to believe what was happening. Either way, I decided to stay. But I promised myself I'd follow every rule from then on. But the house wasn't done with me. The next few nights were quiet. too quiet. I started to feel like I was being watched, and then one morning I woke up to find a strange man standing at the edge of the woods, just like the note had warned. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there, staring at me. I closed the curtains and sat on the floor, my back against the wall, trying to calm my breathing. When I peeked out again a few minutes later, he was gone. The days blurred into each other. I followed the rules religiously, but the house had more in store for me. One night, as I was preparing the bread and salt offering, the lights flickered, and then, out of nowhere, I heard a voice whisper, "Why are you still here?" It sounded like it was coming from right behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. That's when I realized the rules weren't just for my safety. They were to keep something else at bay. Do you think I should have left? Or was I already too far gone? Let me know in the comments, and if you're brave enough to stay, I'll tell you what happened next. The whisper that night wasn't just unsettling. It was a warning. I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the couch, clutching a flashlight, waiting for the sun to rise. When daylight finally broke through the windows, I felt a small wave of relief. But the message was clear. The house knew I was there, and it didn't want me to stay. That morning, I tried to distract myself by unpacking the last of my boxes. As I was pulling out old photos and books, I found something strange. An old leather-bound journal shoved at the back of a drawer in the living room. The name, Eleanor, was etched into the cover, along with a date, 1954. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started flipping through it. The entries were frantic, almost illegible in some places, but one sentence kept appearing over and over again. "The house is alive." The more I read, the more I felt the air around me grow heavy. Eleanor, whoever she was, had lived in this house decades ago. Her words painted a grim picture of her time here. She wrote about the rules, the same ones I'd found on the fridge, and how breaking them came with consequences. One entry stood out. "I heard the footsteps again last night. This time they stopped outside my door. I begged it to leave me alone, but it whispered back, 'You belong to me now.'" I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling. This wasn't just a coincidence. The house had been like this for years, maybe longer. But why was I here? Why had it let me move in? That night I doubled down on the rules. I made the bread and salt offering and locked all the windows. But as midnight approached, the air in the house grew colder, so cold that I could see my breath. And then it started again. The footsteps. But this time they weren't slow. They were running, pounding through the house, coming closer and closer. I grabbed the flashlight and ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing so fast, I thought it might stop. I could hear the footsteps right outside my door now, pacing back and forth. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I didn't dare open the door. I stayed awake all night, my back pressed against the wall, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The next morning, I decided to visit the local library. If Eleanor had written about the house, maybe someone else had too. I spent hours digging through old records, searching for anything about the property. Finally, I found it. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a man named Samuel Carrington. According to the records, Samuel was obsessed with the occult. He believed the house was a gateway to another realm and performed rituals to awaken it. But something went wrong. In 1892, Samuel and his entire family disappeared without a trace. The house sat abandoned for decades until it was sold to Eleanor in the 1950s. She disappeared too. By the time I got back to the house, it was already dark. I felt a lump of dread in my stomach as I stepped inside. The air felt heavier than usual, almost suffocating. As I placed the bread and salt on the counter, I noticed something strange. The offering from the night before was gone. Completely gone. My hands were shaking as I prepared to go to bed, but just as I was about to head upstairs, I saw it. A shadow. It moved across the wall in the living room, but there was nothing there to cast it. It wasn't human-shaped either. It was wrong, twisted, like it didn't belong in this world. I froze, my legs refusing to move. The shadow stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, I heard it again. "Why are you still here?" I don't remember running upstairs, but the next thing I knew, I was in my room with the door locked. I grabbed the journal and started flipping through it again, desperate for answers. One of the last entries caught my eye. "If you break the rules too many times, it will come for you. And when it does, there's no escape." I sat there, staring at the words, feeling like the walls were closing in on me. The next few days were a blur. I followed the rules religiously, but the house wouldn't let me rest. The footsteps, the whispers, the shadows, they were constant now. And then one night, it happened. I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I hadn't locked it. In the dim light, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't the man from the woods, and it wasn't a shadow. It was something else entirely, something I can't even begin to describe. It took a step into the room and I realized I couldn't move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. And then it spoke. "You broke the rules." The voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Low, guttural, and layered, like multiple people speaking at once. It wasn't just the words, it was the weight behind them, as if each syllable pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The figure stepped closer, and I finally managed to force out a trembling whisper. "Well, what do you want from me?" Its response sent shivers down my spine. "You don't belong here, but now you can't leave." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I felt tears streaming down my face, but I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but watch as the figure loomed over me. Its form was shifting, its face a blur of shadows and shapes that refused to stay still. Suddenly the room went pitch black. When I opened my eyes, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the windows and everything seemed normal. But I knew it wasn't. The journal was open on the floor beside me, and a new sentence was scrawled across the page in handwriting that wasn't mine. "You have one chance to make it right." I didn't know what it meant, but I wasn't about to wait and find out. I packed a bag and decided to leave. Rules or not, I couldn't stay in that house another night. But when I tried to open the front door, it wouldn't budge. The locks turned, the handle twisted, but the door stayed shut. I tried the windows, same thing. It was like the house had sealed itself off, trapping me inside. Desperate, I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I hadn't noticed it before, but the house seemed to block out everything. No signal, no Wi-Fi, nothing. That's when I heard it again, the footsteps, but this time they were louder, heavier, as if whoever or whatever was walking wasn't trying to hide anymore. They echoed through the house, moving from room to room, searching, and then they stopped, right outside the living room. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the journal like it was a lifeline. The footsteps were followed by a scratching sound, like nails dragging across the door, and then a voice. "Why won't you listen?" It wasn't the same voice as before. This one was softer, almost pleading, but no less terrifying. I mustered the courage to whisper back, "What do you want from me?" The voice responded, "The rules are not just for you, they are for us. Break them, and we suffer too." The cryptic message left me more confused than ever. What did they mean by we? Who was us? I flipped through the journal again, scanning for anything that might give me a clue. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Hidden among the frantic entries was a list of symbols, each paired with a short description. A circle with a slash. Protection, a spiral, binding, a triangle, release. Eleanor had drawn them all over the pages, and next to one of the symbols she'd written, "When the house is angry, use this to calm it." I didn't understand it completely, but I didn't have a choice. I had to try something. I found a piece of chalk in one of the drawers and carefully drew the circle with the slash on the living room floor. As soon as I finished, the air in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight change in temperature, a faint hum. But then it grew stronger. The walls seemed to vibrate, and the lights flickered. A deep, guttural growl reverberated through the house, and I knew I had made a mistake. The house wasn't calming down. It was getting angrier. Before I could react, the chalk circle began to glow, and the growling turned into a deafening roar. Shadows poured out from the corners of the room, swirling and coalescing into a single, monstrous form. It stood in the center of the circle, towering over me, its eyes glowing like burning embers. "You dare to bind me?" it snarled. I fell to my knees, too terrified to speak. The creature stepped forward, and the circle shattered like glass, the pieces vanishing into thin air. "You don't understand what you've done," it said, its voice like thunder. At that moment, I realized the rules weren't just guidelines. They were a pact, a fragile truce between the house and whatever forces lived within it, and I had broken it. The creature leaned down, its face inches from mine, and whispered, "Now there is no escape." As the creature's whisper faded, I felt the temperature in the room drop even further. My breath came out in white puffs, and my body was frozen, not from the cold, but from fear. The creature stepped back, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. It didn't move to attack me. It didn't need to. "You've crossed the line," it said, its voice echoing like it came from the walls themselves. "This house was built to contain us, to keep us hidden. But you've disturbed the balance." I finally found my voice, though it was trembling. "What do you mean? What balance?" The creature tilted its head, almost as if it were amused. "You think you chose this house. You were brought here, like the others before you, and now you're a part of it." Its words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't just a random tenant. The house had chosen me. But why? I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking. There has to be a way out. What do I need to do? The creature's form began to dissolve into the shadows, but its voice lingered. "Fix what you've broken. Restore the pact, or suffer the same fate as the others." And then it was gone, leaving me alone in the icy silence of the room. I spent the rest of the day poring over Eleanor's journal, desperate to find something, anything, that could help me restore this so-called pact. But most of her entries were fragmented, filled with cryptic warnings and terrified ramblings. One passage stood out. "The house demands balance. If one rule is broken, another must be offered in its place. Only then will it be appeased." Balance. That was the key. But how was I supposed to restore balance when I didn't even know what I'd done wrong? As night fell, the house grew restless again. The shadows moved unnaturally, crawling along the walls like living things. The whispers started, low and unintelligible at first, but growing louder as the hours dragged on. I sat in the living room clutching the journal when I heard it. The footsteps. They weren't alone this time. They were joined by another sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against wood. The sound came from upstairs. I didn't want to go, but something pulled me, a force stronger than my fear. With the flashlight in hand, I climbed the stairs, each step creaking ominously beneath my weight. The tapping led me to a door at the end of the hallway, a door I hadn't noticed before. It was old and worn, its surface covered in strange carvings, symbols like the ones in the journal. The tapping stopped as I reached the door, replaced by a chilling silence. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, and then a voice from behind the door. "Help me." It was faint, almost childlike, but filled with desperation. I pushed the door open, and the air inside was suffocating, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. The room was empty except for a single small bed in the center. On the bed lay a doll, its porcelain face cracked and its glass eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. As I stepped closer, the temperature in the room dropped further, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. They seemed to be coming from the doll itself. I reached out to touch it, but the moment my fingers brushed its surface, a scream tore through the room, a scream that wasn't mine. The door slammed shut behind me, and the room plunged into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. When I finally managed to turn it on, the doll was gone. Instead, standing where the bed had been, was a figure, small, hunched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It whispered, "You broke the pact. You must fix it." Before I could respond, the figure lunged at me, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in the living room. The journal was open in front of me, and another message had been scrawled across the page. "The doll holds the key. Return it to its rightful place." I didn't understand what it meant, but I knew one thing. I had to find that doll. It wasn't just an object. It was part of the house, part of the balance I'd disrupted. But as I stood to search for it, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a child's laughter. The sound of the child's laughter echoed through the house, faint yet unmistakable, sending shivers down my spine. I turned slowly, expecting to see something, anything, but the hallway was empty. I clenched the journal tightly, its cryptic instructions my only guide. I knew I had to find the doll and return it to its rightful place, but I had no idea where that place might be. The laughter sounded again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from one direction. It was all around me. The walls seemed to hum with the sound, as if the house itself was mocking me. Suddenly, a new thought struck me. The basement. I had avoided the basement since the day I moved in. Something about it felt wrong. But now, it felt like the house was guiding me there, urging me to face whatever lay beneath. I made my way to the basement door, every step heavier than the last. The door creaked open, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. The air was colder here, the smell of damp earth stronger. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, flashlight in hand. Then, gathering what little courage I had left, I began to descend. The basement was larger than I had expected, the walls lined with shelves filled with old, dusty objects. At the center of the room was a small table, and on it sat the doll. Its porcelain face was as cracked as before, but its glass eyes now seemed alive, glinting faintly in the dim light. The moment I stepped closer, the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the room like a storm. I reached for the doll, and the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive. The air felt heavier, and the room grew darker, as if the shadows were closing in. Then the voice spoke again. "You must choose." I froze. "Choose what?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The doll's head turned toward me, its glass eyes locking onto mine. It spoke, its voice a mix of childlike innocence and something far darker. "The house demands a sacrifice. Restore the balance, or be consumed." My hands trembled as I held the doll. The journal's cryptic warnings echoed in my mind. The rules are not just for you. They are for us. The house didn't just want the rules followed. It demanded a price for breaking them. Suddenly, the walls of the basement began to shift, revealing images, ghostly figures of those who had lived here before me. Their faces were twisted in agony, their bodies frozen in time. I realized with dawning horror that they were the previous tenants, trapped in the house's grasp because they had failed to restore the balance. The doll's voice grew louder, more insistent. "Choose or stay with them forever." I felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me. If I left the house, someone else would eventually take my place, drawn here like I was. But if I stayed and gave myself to the house, it might end the cycle. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "What do you want from me?" The doll's cracked smile seemed to widen. "Your choice will decide the fate of us all. Sacrifice yourself or pass the burden." I thought of Eleanor, of the countless others whose lives had been consumed by this place. I thought of the voices, the shadows, the rules, and I made my choice. I placed the doll back on the table and stood in the center of the room. The air grew colder, and the shadows swirled around me, pulling me into their embrace. As they closed in, I whispered, "Let this end with me." The house trembled, its walls shaking violently, and for a brief moment I felt a sense of peace. The whispers faded, the laughter ceased, and the shadows dissolved into the darkness. When I opened my eyes, the house was empty. The oppressive energy was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. The journal lay at my feet, its pages blank, as if the story had been erased. I walked to the front door, and this time it opened easily. Sunlight poured in, and I stepped outside, feeling the warmth on my skin. But as I turned to look back at the house, I saw something that chilled me to my core. A "for sale" sign on the lawn, with the words "newly renovated, move-in ready." The cycle had ended for me, but it hadn't ended for the house.